He is universally known as the voice of God, the man whose mere presence transforms ordinary dialogue into absolute truth. For decades, Morgan Freeman has narrated our dreams, guided our stories, and embodied the ultimate symbol of wisdom and dignity on the silver screen. But behind the comforting baritone and the billion-dollar box office lies a reality that completely shatters the Hollywood illusion. At 88 years old, Morgan Freeman carries the unbearable weight of life forged in agonizing delays and devastating losses. Behind the legend stands a man who endured 5 decades of brutal, suffocating rejection before the world finally learned his name. A survivor of a catastrophic highway crash that permanently paralyzed his left hand, trapping him in a daily, invisible prison of chronic physical agony. A grandfather who was forced to endure the unthinkable tragedy of his beloved granddaughter's life being violently, senselessly stolen on a cold city street. And an icon who watched a sacred, 80-year reputation face a sudden, humiliating public reckoning that threatened to erase everything he had ever built. How does the voice of God find the strength to speak when his own universe is violently collapsing? What is the terrifying cost of achieving your greatest dreams only in the twilight of your life? And what happens when the ultimate cinematic mentor runs out of words to make sense of his own suffering? Before we answer these questions, we must go back to the beginning. To understand the legend at 88, you must first meet the invisible boy from the Deep South. The cotton fields, the architecture of silence, and the invisible boy. There is a profound, almost unimaginable irony in the way the universe chooses to distribute its greatest gifts. Today, the entire globe recognizes Morgan Freeman as the undisputed voice of God. His deep, resonant baritone is the ultimate symbol of wisdom, authority, and absolute, unshakable dignity. When he speaks, the world naturally, instinctively falls silent to listen. But if you trace that magnificent world-altering voice back to its very genesis, you will not find a golden microphone. You will not find a prestigious theater academy or a life of privileged encouragement. You will find an incredibly small, terrified boy standing in the suffocating, dusty heat of the Mississippi Delta, existing in a world that was systematically, violently designed to ensure he never spoke above a whisper. Morgan Porterfield Freeman was born on June 1st, 1937, in Memphis, Tennessee. He arrived into an America that was paralyzed by the devastating economic collapse of the Great Depression, but the financial ruin was only a fraction of the darkness awaiting him. He was born a black child in the Deep South during the absolute tyrannical height of the Jim Crow era. His father, Morgan Sr., was a barber, a proud man struggling to maintain his dignity in an economy completely rigged against his ambition. His mother, Mamie E'Dena, worked as a teacher and a cleaner, taking any grueling, back-breaking job she could find just to put a meager meal on the table. But the mathematics of survival in the 1930s were utterly ruthless. Even 2 incomes were not enough to keep the fragile family intact. When Morgan was still an infant, his parents made the agonizing, heart-wrenching decision that countless desperate families were forced to make during that era. They packed their belongings to travel north in search of factory work in Chicago, and they sent their young son away. Morgan was sent to live primarily with his paternal grandmother in the tiny, impoverished town of Charleston, Mississippi. To understand the architecture of Morgan Freeman's soul, you must first understand the absolute, grinding reality of Charleston in the early 1940s. Poverty was not just a temporary condition, it was the very air they breathed. His grandmother's small, wooden house offered no electricity. There was no indoor plumbing. Water was drawn by hand, and the nights were lit only by the flickering, weak glow of kerosene lamps. Decades later, looking back at the profound, dusty deprivation of his childhood, Morgan delivered a quote of such startling, unvarnished honesty that it completely strips away the romanticism of the past. "We were so poor. We didn't even know we were poor," he confessed, his voice carrying the calm, steady weight of a man who had survived the bottom of the earth. "We had nothing to compare it to. Everyone around us lived the exact same way. You just accepted it as the only reality." Childhood in Charleston did not mean playing with toys or dreaming of a limitless future. It meant physical labor. It meant walking into the sprawling, endless cotton fields under a merciless, scorching sun, dragging heavy canvas sacks, picking cotton for pennies a day until his small fingers bled. It meant wearing shirts and pants meticulously, desperately stitched together from empty flour sacks, because store-bought clothing was a luxury existing in an entirely different universe. But the physical poverty was merely a backdrop to a much darker, infinitely more dangerous psychological prison. Growing up in the segregated South meant learning the terrifying, unwritten rules of survival before you even learned how to read. Black children were forced to enter businesses through back doors. They drank from separate, rusted water fountains. They walked miles along dusty roads to reach crumbling one-room schoolhouses equipped with outdated, discarded books, while they watched shiny yellow buses carry white children to well-funded schools. The racism of the 1940s was not abstract or subtle. It was a suffocating, atmospheric pressure of everyday life. It was a shopkeeper who refused to look a black child in the eye. It was a terrifying, unspoken understanding that one wrong word, one wrong glance, or one failure to step off the sidewalk could result in immediate, catastrophic violence. You learn to keep your head down, Morgan later admitted, outlining the tragic, necessary defense mechanism of his youth. You learn to survive by becoming invisible. You learn to survive by becoming invisible. Listen to the breathtaking, agonizing sorrow of that reality. The man who would eventually become the most recognizable, commanding presence in global cinema spent the entire foundation of his life actively trying not to be seen. He was a boy trapped inside a heavy, silent armor, swallowing his own voice just to ensure he could survive to see the next morning. But inside that invisible, silent boy, an immense, restless fire was quietly burning in the dark. The universe, with its brilliant, unpredictable sense of timing, delivered a miracle to Morgan Freeman when he was just 9 years old. And beautifully, it did not happen because of ambition. It happened because of a childhood mistake. In 1946, young Morgan pulled a chair out from under a girl he had a crush on in his classroom. As punishment for the disruption, his exasperated teacher ordered him to participate in the school's drama tournament. It was meant to be a disciplinary exercise, a way to force a mischievous, quiet boy out of his comfort zone. Instead, it was a divine revelation. Morgan was cast in the lead role of a school play. The moment he stepped onto that makeshift wooden stage, standing under the warm, dusty glow of the simple theater lights, the entire molecular structure of his existence fundamentally shifted. When he looked out at the audience, something absolutely miraculous happened. For the very first time in his 9 years on Earth, he was not invisible. He was not just a poor boy wearing clothes made of flour sacks. He was not a second-class citizen in a segregated town. He had a script. He had a voice. And the people in the room were entirely, absolutely captivated by him. He delivered his lines, and the audience laughed. They applauded. It was a small, modest crowd of parents and teachers, but to the boy from the cotton fields, the applause sounded like a roaring, magnificent ocean. He won top honors in the statewide drama competition. "I fell in love with acting that day," he would later reflect, revealing the profound, life-altering psychology of that specific afternoon. Not because of the attention, but because for the first time, I felt like I actually mattered. I felt powerful. Acting was not a hobby for Morgan Freeman. It was oxygen. For a boy who was suffocating under the heavy, oppressive silence of the Jim Crow South, the stage was the only place on the entire planet where he was granted the absolute, undeniable dignity of being a human being. But a single school play does not rewrite the brutal mathematics of poverty. A burst of applause cannot fill an empty stomach. Following the death of his grandmother, the agonizing, nomadic instability of his family resumed. He moved to Chicago to lie with his mother, then to Gary, Indiana, and finally back to Greenwood, Mississippi. Stability was an impossible luxury. He attended multiple schools, always the outsider, always a new kid, retreating into the quiet sanctuary of cinema and radio programs to escape the chaos of his reality. At Broad Street High School in Greenwood, he threw himself entirely into the drama club, while other teenage boys played football or took after-school jobs at the local mills. Morgan obsessed over characters, memorized dialogue, and desperately built imaginary worlds where he was the king, the hero, and the master of his own fate. His teachers noticed a profound, undeniable gravity he possessed. One drama instructor pulled him aside and told him, "You have a gift. Don't waste it." It was a beautiful, inspiring sentiment. But as Morgan graduated from high school in 1955, the cold, uncompromising reality of the American entertainment industry stared him directly in the face. In the 1950s, Hollywood was an impenetrable, locked fortress for a young black man. The roles available were strictly relegated to subservient stereotypes: the nameless janitor, the quiet chauffeur, the background extra. Sidney Poitier was only just beginning to force the heavy doors open. But for a penniless, 18-year-old kid from Mississippi with absolutely no connections, traveling to Los Angeles to become a leading man was considered pathetic, laughable delusion. Morgan realized that if he chased his dream now, he would starve. So, in an act of profound, pragmatic desperation, the boy who just found his voice made a decision to put it back into a box. He turned down a partial drama scholarship to Jackson State University, a choice that still haunts the mythology of his career. Instead, he looked up at the sky, packed his meager belongings, and enlisted in the United States Air Force. He thought he was escaping the cotton fields. He thought he was walking toward discipline, honor, and the glorious, soaring freedom of becoming a fighter pilot. But the invisible boy was about to discover that the military was not a runway. It was simply another, more heavily structured cage. And the agonizing 30-year wilderness of rejection that awaited him was about to test the absolute limits of his sanity, demanding a price so devastating that he would nearly abandon the dream of acting forever. The 30-year exile, the taxi driver, and the illusion of time. There's a deeply romanticized, incredibly deceptive myth in American culture that pure talent will always, inevitably find its way to the surface. We are taught to believe that if a person works hard enough, the universe will eventually reward them with the spotlight they deserve before their youth fades away. But the universe does not operate on a Hollywood schedule. Sometimes the universe demands a waiting period so long, so brutally exhausting, that it systematically breaks the spirit of almost everyone who attempts to climb. In 1955, an 18-year-old Morgan Freeman enlisted in the United States Air Force. He was a boy running from the crushing poverty of Mississippi, fueled by a cinematic fantasy. He had watched war movies in the darkened theaters of his youth, and he believed that becoming a fighter pilot would grant him the ultimate, soaring freedom he had been entirely denied on the ground. But the military machinery quickly shattered the romantic illusion. He was not assigned to the cockpit of a fighter jet. Instead, he was trained as an automatic tracking radar repairman. For 4 years, the boy who possessed the most magnificent commanding voice in the world was forced to sit in dark, windowless rooms, staring silently at the glowing green blips on a radar screen. It was a completely different kind of solitary confinement. "I thought the Air Force would give me disciplined direction," Morgan later confessed, reflecting on the bitter disappointment of his military service. "Instead, it taught me what I didn't want to be. I was sitting there, looking at a screen, and I realized I was just playing a part. I wasn't a soldier. I was an actor pretending to be one." In 1959, at 22 years old, he secured an honorable discharge. He packed his meager belongings into a single duffel bag and took a bus to Los Angeles. He arrived in Hollywood expecting an opportunity, but he was met with an impenetrable, freezing wall of indifference. In the late 1950s, the major studios were not looking for a tall, intensely serious black man with a deep Southern cadence to play leading roles. They offered him the exact same humiliating stereotypes he thought he had escaped: the nameless bellhop, the silent janitor, the background extra. He lasted barely a year in Los Angeles before the constant, soul-crushing rejections wore his optimism down to the bone. Believing the theater might offer a sliver of artistic dignity, Morgan packed his single suitcase again and moved across the country to the freezing, chaotic streets of New York City. But New York was a completely different kind of battlefield. The 1960s in Manhattan were a grueling test of physical and psychological endurance. The rent was merciless. The audition rooms were packed with hundreds of desperate, starving artists fighting over a single, poorly paid role. To survive, Morgan took absolutely any blue-collar job he could find. He worked as a transcript clerk at Los Angeles City College, filing endless stacks of paperwork. He danced in the chorus line of the 1964 World's Fair in Queens. And most famously, he drove a yellow taxi through the unforgiving, chaotic traffic of Manhattan. Imagine the profound, cinematic heartbreak of that specific visual. A man possessing the gravity of a Shakespearean king, gripping the steering wheel of a dirty cab in the pouring rain, picking up wealthy passengers in the theater district, and mentally rehearsing monologues while staring at the red taillights in front of him. Every single dollar he earned went toward rent, cheap food, and the desperate, flickering hope that the next audition would finally be the one. But the next audition was never the one. The years began to pass with a terrifying, silent velocity. Morgan turned 25, then 28, then 30. For the older audiences watching this, for anyone who has ever watched the prime of their life slip through their fingers while waiting for a breakthrough that stubbornly refuses to arrive, the psychological weight of those passing birthdays is an absolute, suffocating terror. Morgan watched his peers give up. He watched friends from acting classes abandon their dreams, move back to their hometowns, and take safe, predictable jobs. I spent years being invisible on stage, just like I was invisible back in Mississippi, Morgan later admitted with breathtaking, brutal self-awareness. Only now I was invisible by choice, and that made it infinitely worse. In 1967, the pressure of his reality compounded dramatically. He married Jeanette Adair Bradshaw. Suddenly, Morgan was not just a starving artist responsible for himself. He was a father. He adopted Jeanette's daughter, and together they raised a family. The dream of acting suddenly felt incredibly selfish. He had mouths to feed. He bounced between off-Broadway productions and experimental regional theaters that paid absolute pennies. He secured a minor role in the all-black Broadway production of Hello, Dolly, starring Pearl Bailey in 1967, which provided a brief, vital paycheck, but it did not catapult him to stardom. By the time the 1970s arrived, Morgan Freeman was approaching 35 years old. His marriage was straining under the immense, crushing weight of financial anxiety. Hollywood still saw him as entirely expendable. Depression, heavy and suffocating, began to creep into the corners of his small New York apartment. He seriously considered quitting. He wondered if he had made a catastrophic, lifelong mistake by refusing the safe path. And then in 1971, the universe finally threw him a lifeline, but it arrived in the most absurd, unexpected, and creatively frustrating package imaginable. Morgan was cast in a PBS educational children's television show called The Electric Company. He was hired to play a character named Easy Reader, a smooth-talking, brightly dressed hipster designed to make reading look cool for kindergartners. It was a steady paycheck. It offered national television exposure. It finally provided his family with the financial stability they had been desperately praying for. But for a man who had spent 15 years studying complex, classical theater, the role felt like a brightly colored, inescapable trap. For 5 long years, Morgan put on the costume. He smiled for the cameras. He sang the educational songs. He became incredibly beloved by millions of young children across America. But the adults, the casting directors, the prominent filmmakers, the people who actually control the gates of Hollywood, did not take Easy Reader seriously. They saw a children's television entertainer, not a dramatic powerhouse. By the time the show ended, Morgan Freeman was 40 years old. He was universally beloved by 5-year-olds and completely, utterly invisible to the cinematic establishment. The dream he had chased since he was a 9-year-old boy in Mississippi felt further away than it ever had. The lost decade of his 20s had violently mutated into the lost decade of his 30s. As he stared into the mirror of his early 40s, the man with the voice of a god resigned himself to a painful, quiet truth. He believed he was never going to be a movie star. He accepted that he had missed his golden window, and he prepared to quietly fade into the background of the theater circuit. But the universe, operating on a magnificent, delayed timeline that defies all human comprehension, was merely letting his soul marinate. The 30 years of agonizing rejection, the grueling taxi shifts, and the quiet desperation of his poverty had not broken him. They had seasoned him. The 50-year-old actor was about to step out of the shadows, bringing an absolute, volcanic intensity to the silver screen that would completely shock the Hollywood system. The longest, most agonizing winter in the history of American cinema was finally coming to an end, and the late bloomer was preparing to deliver a masterclass in patience that would alter the industry forever. The late bloomer, the voice of truth and the burden of time. There is an incredibly romanticized, deeply comforting narrative that Hollywood loves to sell to the public. It is the myth of the late bloomer. We love the story of the seasoned, gray-haired veteran who suddenly emerges from obscurity to claim the ultimate prize. We applaud the perseverance. We celebrate the triumph. But what the slick, polished Hollywood narrative deliberately ignores is the agonizing, irreversible cost of waiting 50 years for the world to simply acknowledge your existence. When success finally arrives at the age of 50, it does not arrive with the unburdened, explosive joy of youth. It arrives carrying a heavy, deeply complicated suitcase full of ghosts. By the early 1980s, Morgan Freeman had entirely resigned himself to the quiet, dignified purgatory of the theater circuit. He assumed the cameras would never truly find him, but he refused to surrender his craft. He channeled 30 years of profound frustration, racial marginalization, and blue-collar exhaustion into the stage. He performed Shakespeare. He originated the role of Hope Colburn in the off-Broadway production of Driving Miss Daisy. He commanded the live audience with a gravitational pull that simply could not be ignored any longer. The film industry, which had spent 3 decades staring right past him, finally woke up. In 1987, at the astonishing age of 50, Morgan was cast in the gritty thriller Street Smart. He played Fast Black, a volatile, unpredictable, and dangerously magnetic street hustler opposite Christopher Reeve. For the audiences who only knew him as the brightly dressed, educational, easy reader from children's television, the transformation was an absolute, terrifying shock to the system. Morgan's performance was volcanic. It was dangerous. It was a masterclass in controlled, simmering intimidation. When the Academy Award nominations were announced in 1988, Morgan Freeman's name appeared on the prestigious list for the very first time. Best Supporting Actor. After half a century of breathing the dust of Mississippi, driving taxis in the rain, and scraping by on pennies, the Invisible Man was finally, undeniably seen. He didn't win the statue that night, but the nomination fundamentally altered the atmospheric pressure of his life. Suddenly, the casting directors who had previously offered him nameless, humiliating background roles were desperately scrambling to send him their best scripts. Then came 1989, the year Morgan Freeman permanently transitioned from a working actor into an undisputed American institution. He reprised a stage role in the cinematic adaptation of Driving Miss Daisy alongside the legendary Jessica Tandy. The film was a quiet, profound meditation on race, aging, dignity, and the incredibly complex evolution of friendship in the Jim Crow South. Morgan did not just act the part of Hope Colburn. He poured the absolute, unvarnished history of his own childhood into the character. He channeled the men he grew up watching in Mississippi, men who were forced to keep their heads down, but who retained an unbreakable, majestic pride in their souls. His performance was the beating heart of the film. It was understated, incredibly powerful, and entirely heartbreaking. He earned his second Academy Award nomination, this time for Best Actor. That exact same year, he starred alongside Denzel Washington in the monumental Civil War epic glory, lending immense humanity and historical gravity to every single frame he inhabited. At 52 years old, Morgan Freeman was not just working, he was absolutely thriving. He was universally hailed as one of the greatest living actors on the planet. But behind the blinding flashbulbs and the glamorous magazine covers, the bitter arithmetic of lost time continued to haunt his quiet moments. Reflecting on the incredibly complicated emotional reality of achieving your wildest dreams when most men are preparing for retirement, Morgan delivered a quote of such startling, melancholy honesty that it strips away all the vanity of fame. "I spent 30 years preparing for success that came when most actors retire," he admitted, his deep voice carrying the heavy weight of the wilderness years. "Part of me was grateful. Another part was angry it took so long. Listen to the breathtaking vulnerability of that confession. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who have sacrificed their youth to build a business, or those who finally achieve financial stability only after their children had already grown up and moved away, that sentence strikes an incredibly deep, painful chord. Fame had finally arrived, but it arrived far too late to save his first marriage. The grueling financial anxiety, the constant moving, and the obsessive pursuit of an impossible dream had completely crushed his union with Jeanette. They had divorced in 1979. By the time the millions of dollars and the red carpet invitations began to pour in, he was standing at the summit of the world, entirely alone. He married Myrna Khalili in 1990, desperately hoping that this new chapter of unimaginable success would finally allow him to balance love and legacy. And the legacy was about to be permanently etched into the bedrock of global culture. In 1994, a prison drama called The Shawshank Redemption was released in theaters. Initially, it was a box office disappointment, a quiet film that audiences largely ignored. But Morgan Freeman's performance as Ellis Boyd Red Redding, the institutionalized, deeply cynical, yet ultimately hopeful inmate who narrates the entire journey, carried profound, spiritual weight that transcended the screen. His voice, measured, weary, rhythmic, and incredibly resonant, became the absolute soul of the story. As Shawshank found a massive second life on television and home video, eventually being universally crowned as one of the greatest cinematic masterpieces ever made, Morgan's voice became inseparable from the very concept of profound wisdom. When he delivered the legendary opening line, "I guess it comes down to a simple choice, really. Get busy living or get busy dying," it wasn't just dialogue written by a screenwriter. It was scripture. It was the ultimate, defining philosophy of a man who had spent 30 years refusing to die in the shadows of Hollywood. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Morgan Freeman had become the definitive moral compass of the entertainment industry. He played detectives, presidents, and eventually, in Bruce Almighty, he played God himself. And the world accepted it without a single question. Because if any human being possessed the authority, the immense dignity, and the comforting resonance to portray the creator of the universe, it was the boy who had survived the cotton fields of Mississippi. By his late 60s, his net worth was soaring toward hundreds of millions of dollars. He purchased a breathtaking 124-acre ranch in Charleston, Mississippi. Think about the magnificent, earth-shattering triumph of that real estate purchase. The invisible, impoverished boy who was treated as a second-class citizen in the Jim Crow South had returned to the exact same state as a multimillionaire landowner, a global icon, and a cultural king. He flew his own private planes. He indulged in the luxurious hobbies he had been entirely denied during his decades of poverty. He had completely, unequivocally beaten the odds. He had built an unassailable fortress of respect and wealth. But the universe, operating with its trademark, terrifying indifference to human achievement, was quietly preparing to demonstrate just how fragile a Hollywood fortress truly is. In the summer of 2008, at the absolute untouchable peak of his powers, Morgan Freeman was about to climb into a car on a dark Mississippi highway. He was about to experience a sudden, violent, and catastrophic collision that would not just shatter his physical body, but permanently trap the cinematic voice of God inside an invisible, inescapable prison of agonizing chronic pain. The hardest, most grueling chapter of his existence was waiting just around the bend in the road. The shattered hand, the compression glove, and the invisible prison. There's a highly deceptive, incredibly seductive illusion that accompanies extreme wealth and global reverence. When a man reaches his 70s, sitting on $250 million, flying his own private jets, and universally recognized as the cinematic voice of God, he naturally assumes he has finally outrun the brutal unpredictability of the universe. He believes he has purchased a permanent exemption from ordinary suffering. But destiny, operating with its trademark, terrifying indifference, does not care about the size of a man's estate or the golden statues on his mantle. By the summer of 2008, Morgan Freeman was 71 years old. He was living exactly the life he had dreamed of as a starving, invisible boy in the segregated South. But the universe was quietly preparing to demonstrate, with absolute violent clarity, just how incredibly fragile the human vessel truly is. On the dark, humid night of August 3rd, 2008, Morgan was driving his 1997 Nissan Maxima along the remote, winding stretches of Highway 32 in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. It was the exact same state where he had once picked cotton under a merciless sun, the exact same back roads where he had once walked as a terrified, second-class citizen. He was returning to his sprawling 124-acre ranch, a living monument to his impossible triumph. And then, in a fraction of a microscopic second, the monument completely collapsed. The vehicle veered off the dark rural highway. It flipped multiple times, tearing through the air before violently crumpling into a terrifying, unrecognizable mass of twisted steel and shattered glass. When emergency responders finally arrived at the desolate scene, they encountered a nightmare. The 71-year-old Hollywood legend was completely trapped inside the crushed wreckage. To extract him, the rescue crews were forced to use the jaws of life, methodically cutting through the heavy metal just to pull his broken, bleeding body from the ruins. Morgan was immediately airlifted to the Regional Medical Center in Memphis, Tennessee, the very same city where he had been born 7 decades prior. The circular irony of his geography was staggering. The man who had spent his entire life trying to escape the gravity of the Deep South had been violently dragged back into its soil, broken and bleeding, fighting for his life. Surgeons worked frantically through the night to repair the catastrophic damage. But when Morgan finally awoke from a heavy, suffocating fog of anesthesia, the medical professionals delivered a verdict that would permanently, irrevocably alter the remaining years of his life. His left shoulder was completely shattered. The delicate, intricate network of nerves running down his left arm had been severely, permanently severed. The doctors look at the man whose elegant, commanding physical presence had anchored masterpiece film for decades and told him the cold, unvarnished truth. His left hand would never fully function again. For a man in his 70s, a severe physical trauma does not simply heal. It sets up a permanent residence in the body. The severed nerves did not just paralyze his hand. They triggered a devastating, unrelenting, and completely incurable chronic pain condition known as fibromyalgia. For the older audiences watching this, for the men and women who wake up every single morning and are forced to negotiate with their own skeletons, whose joints burn and whose muscles ache with a ghost-like, invisible fire, fibromyalgia is an absolute, waking nightmare. It is a disorder that floods the nervous system with stabbing, excruciating pain that migrates up and down the body without any warning or mercy. Reflecting on the sheer daily agony of his new reality, Morgan stripped away the polished veneer of the movie star to deliver a quote of startling, agonizing vulnerability. "It's the fibromyalgia," he confessed in a rare interview, wincing as he grabbed his shoulder. "Up and down the arm. That's where it gets so bad. Excruciating. It's a never-ending ache. It follows me everywhere, every moment of every day. It follows me everywhere, every moment of every day. Listen to the profound, suffocating exhaustion in those words. To manage the severe swelling and the pooling of blood in his paralyzed limb, Morgan was forced to wear a tight, black compression glove on his left hand. To the casual observer on a red carpet, the glove looked like a quirky, eccentric fashion statement. But to Morgan, it was a heavy, suffocating medical necessity. It was a visible, undeniable proof that his own body had permanently betrayed him. The psychological toll of this injury was a staggering, invisible burden. Imagine the absolutely breathtaking, almost cruel paradox of his existence from 2008 onward. He was playing the President of the United States. He was playing Nelson Mandela in Invictus. He was literally playing God. Millions of people looked at him and saw absolute, omnipotent authority. But when the director yelled cut, the god of cinema had to retreat to his trailer, heavily rely on assistants just to button his shirt, tie his shoes, or grip a simple pen. Directors had to completely restructure his scenes, carefully choreographing camera angles to hide his paralyzed hand from the audience. He had to learn how to play golf with one arm. He was trapped inside a multi-million-dollar empire, yet he was permanently locked inside a physical cage of chronic, excruciating pain. You can fight a lot of things in this world, Morgan once mused quietly, but you can't fight your own body. He refused to retire. He pushed through the burning nerve pain because, for a man who had waited 30 years to finally be seen by Hollywood, stepping away from the camera meant surrendering to the darkness. He smiled through the agony, walked the red carpets, and continued to lend his magnificent, unshakable voice to a world that desperately needed his wisdom. He believed he had survived the absolute worst hand the universe could possibly deal him. He had survived the poverty of Jim Crow. He had survived the decades of Hollywood rejection. And now, he had survived the catastrophic mangling of his own physical body. He assumed the final chapters of his life would simply be a quiet, dignified management of his physical pain. But the universe operated with an almost incomprehensible, terrifying malice, was quietly sharpening a blade in the shadows of New York City. The physical agony of his shattered left hand was merely a prelude. It was a cruel rehearsal for a psychological devastation so complete, so absolutely annihilating, that no amount of wisdom, no amount of wealth, and no amount of acting could ever prepare him for it. The voice of God was about to be completely, permanently silenced by the bloodiest, most senseless tragedy a grandfather could ever endure. The stolen light, the silent God, and the ultimate agony. There is a fundamental, unspoken contract that governs the natural order of human existence. We accept that parents will eventually age, that our heroes will inevitably grow old, and that the elderly will quietly pass the torch to the youth. We accept the fading of the light, provided it happens in the correct, chronological sequence. But when the universe violently breaks that contract, when a grandparent is forced to stand in a cemetery and bury a child who is just beginning to bloom, the natural architecture of reality completely collapses. It is a psychological apocalypse. It is a sorrow so incredibly dense, so absolutely suffocating, that it cannot be articulated in any human language. By the summer of 2015, Morgan Freeman was 78 years old. He had survived the crushing, invisible poverty of the Jim Crow South. He had endured 30 agonizing years of Hollywood rejection. He had adapted to the chronic, blazing nerve pain of fibromyalgia, wearing his compression glove, like a quiet badge of survival. He was an incredibly wealthy, universally revered cinematic titan. But the universe, operating with an indifferent, terrifying cruelty, was about to prove that absolutely no amount of money and no amount of global reverence can purchase a shield against random, senseless tragedy. E'Dena Hines was 33 years old. She was radiant, deeply ambitious, and brimming with undeniable, infectious joy. Technically, she was the granddaughter of Morgan's first wife, Jeanette. But biology is merely a footnote in the history of true love. Morgan had helped raise E'Dena since she was a little girl. He had funded her education, nurtured her dreams of becoming an actress, and remained a fierce, deeply protective father figure to her long after his divorce from Jeanette had been finalized. To Morgan, E'Dena was not just family. She was an absolute anchor to his humanity. She was one of the very few people on Earth who had known him long before the Academy Awards, before the private jets, and before he became the voice of God. She loved him simply, beautifully, as Grandpa Morgan. On the early, quiet morning of August 16, 2015, on a sidewalk in the Washington Heights neighborhood of New York City, a horrific, incomprehensible nightmare unfolded. The exact details of that morning belong to the tragic, private archives of a grieving family. But what the world came to understand was that E'Dena became the victim of a sudden, extreme, and senseless act of violence committed by a partner battling severe, untreated psychological demons. In a matter of terrifying, chaotic minutes, on the cold, unforgiving concrete of the city she loved, the bright, 33-year-old light of E'Dena Hines was abruptly and permanently extinguished. When the devastating phone call reached Morgan, he was miles away, resting at his quiet, 124-acre sanctuary in Mississippi. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated devastation of that exact moment. You are 78 years old. You have spent your entire adult life playing presidents, judges, and wise mentors who can solve any crisis. You have literally portrayed the creator of the universe. But as you hold the telephone to your ear, listening to the absolute worst news a grandfather can ever receive, you are completely, fundamentally powerless. He immediately flew to New York City, arriving into a chaotic, surreal landscape of flashing police lights and yellow caution tape. And it is here that the most heartbreaking, magnificent irony of Morgan Freeman's life revealed itself. For half a century, Morgan had been the undisputed voice of comfort for the entire planet. He narrated the march of penguins across freezing ice. He narrated the mysteries of the cosmos. He delivered the poetic, soul-saving monologues of the Shawshank Redemption, telling millions of strangers how to find hope in the dark. But standing near the shadow of that terrible sidewalk, completely hollowed out by grief, the man with the greatest voice in the history of modern cinema was entirely speechless. He could not find a single word to make sense of the abyss. The voice of God had been completely, violently silenced. Eventually, relying on the quiet, stoic dignity he had forged in the cotton field of his youth, Morgan released a brief statement to the world. Stripped of all Hollywood bravado, his words were a beautiful, agonizing tribute to the girl he had loved so deeply. The world will never know her artistry and talent, and how much she had to offer, the statement read, carrying the heavy, unbearable weight of a broken patriarch. Her friends and family were fortunate enough to have known what she meant as a person. Her star will continue to shine bright in our hearts, thoughts, and prayers. May she rest in peace. The world will never know how much she had to offer. For the older audiences watching this, especially the grandparents who live in constant, quiet fear for the safety of their grandchildren in an increasingly unpredictable world, that sentence is a devastating emotional strike. It is the agonizing realization that an entire future, a lifetime of potential weddings, career triumphs, and quiet Sunday dinners, have been violently stolen in the night. But the tragedy did not end with the loss of her life. Because Morgan Freeman was a global icon, the media refused to grant him the basic, fundamental human dignity of mourning in peace. In the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, the most cynical, ruthless corners of the tabloid industry seized upon his immense grief and weaponized it. Disgusting, entirely baseless rumors began to circulate, falsely suggesting an inappropriate relationship between Morgan and his granddaughter. It was a vile, fabricated narrative designed entirely to generate clicks and sell magazines by exploiting a family's deepest nightmare. Morgan's legal team issued fierce, immediate denials. E'Dena's own mother publicly condemned the rumors as disgusting lies. But the psychological damage was already done. The man who had just buried his granddaughter was forced to expend his precious, exhausting energy defending his own morality against an anonymous digital mob. It was a profound violation layered directly on top of an unimaginable tragedy. It proved that the spotlight of Hollywood is not a halo. It is a magnifying glass that burns everything it touches. Morgan eventually retreated back to the quiet, isolated sanctuary of his Mississippi ranch. Those who worked with him the years following 2015 noticed a subtle, permanent shift in his demeanor. He still showed up to movie sets. He still delivered his lines with immaculate, flawless precision. But the quiet, mischievous sparkle that used to animate his eyes, the gentle, knowing warmth that made audiences fall in love with him, had significantly dimmed. When asked in subsequent interviews about his greatest regrets, the aging legend paused for a long, heavy moment before replying quietly, not being there when it mattered most. It was an admission of absolute, crushing survivor's guilt. He had survived poverty, racism, and a catastrophic car crash, only to realize that all the Oscars and all the wealth in the world were completely powerless to protect the little girl who used to sit on his lap. He assumed the cruelest chapters of his life were finally behind him. He assumed he would spend the rest of his 80s quietly managing his physical pain and his private grief. But the universe, operating with an almost theatrical malice, was quietly preparing the final, most humiliating test of his entire existence. The man who had spent 80 years building an impeccable, sacred reputation as the absolute moral conscience of America was about to wake up to a global cultural reckoning. And in the blink of an eye, the perfect, towering monument of his legacy was going to be publicly, ruthlessly placed on trial. The public reckoning, the falling monument, and the illusion of God. There is a terrifying, universally acknowledged truth about the architecture of a human legacy. It takes 80 exhausting, agonizing years of relentless discipline to build a monument of absolute, unblemished respect. But in the modern, hyper-connected, and deeply unforgiving digital era, it takes exactly one afternoon for that entire monument to be reduced to dust. For decades, Morgan Freeman was not just an actor. He was an incredibly rare, almost mythological institution. He was the undisputed moral conscience of Hollywood. He had played judges, presidents, wise mentors, and even the creator of the universe. The public looked at his silver hair, listened to his resonant, comforting voice, and collectively decided that he was the absolute embodiment of dignity and truth. His reputation was not just clean, it was considered sacred. But a sacred reputation in Hollywood is merely a fragile illusion waiting for the wind to change. And in the spring of 2018, a massive, unprecedented cultural reckoning was sweeping violently across the entertainment industry. The era of silent complicity was over, and the spotlight of accountability was actively searching for the darkest corners of the business. In May of 2018, that blinding, merciless spotlight suddenly swung away from the traditional villains of the industry and locked its crosshairs directly onto the chest of the 81-year-old cinematic god. A major news network published a detailed, highly publicized investigative report. Multiple women, production assistants, junior staff members, and entertainment reporters came forward with allegations of inappropriate workplace dynamics and unwelcome comments spanning several years. They described a pattern of behavior that made them feel deeply uncomfortable, objectified, and powerless in the presence of a global titan. To be absolutely clear, none of the allegations involved criminal conduct. There were no lawsuits filed, and Morgan Freeman never faced any criminal charges. But in the ruthless, high-speed arena of the court of public opinion, legal distinctions are entirely irrelevant. The cultural moment demanded absolute perfection, and the untouchable icon had suddenly been touched. The response in the corporate world was instantaneous and devastating. Within a matter of hours, massive global brands that had paid millions to associate their products with his trustworthy voice immediately pulled their advertising campaigns. The Screen Actors Guild publicly announced it was reconsidering the Lifetime Achievement Award it had just handed him. Projects were quietly shelved. The man who had spent 30 years of his youth begging to be seen was suddenly begging to hide. Morgan issued a statement that very same day. It was an attempt to extinguish the raging fire, but it fundamentally lacked the polished, flawless execution the world had come to expect from him. Anyone who knows me or has worked with me knows I am not someone who would intentionally offend or knowingly make anyone feel uneasy, Morgan stated, attempting to salvage his humanity amidst the chaos. I apologize to anyone who felt uncomfortable or disrespected. That was never my intent. But the apology fell hollow to the rapidly mobilizing internet mob. Critics aggressively pointed out that he had apologized for their feelings, but he had not issued a blanket denial of the behavior itself. 2 days later, realizing that the foundation of his entire existence was violently cracking, the 81-year-old actor issued a second, far more defensive and incredibly desperate statement. This statement stripped away the calm, omnipotent narrator and revealed a terrified, aging man watching his life's work evaporate. I am devastated that 80 years of my life is at risk of being undermined in the blink of an eye by Thursday's media reports. I am devastated that 80 years of my life is at risk of being undermined in the blink of an eye. Listen to profound existential terror echoing inside those words. For the older audiences watching this, especially those who understand that a person's legacy is the absolute only thing they leave behind when the physical body fails, that sentence is an agonizing, deeply sympathetic cry of despair. Morgan was 81 years old. He had survived the suffocating, violent poverty of the Jim Crow South. He had endured 3 decades of humiliating, invisible poverty in New York. He had survived a catastrophic car crash that left him in chronic, daily physical agony. He had buried his murdered granddaughter. He had climbed from absolute invisibility to become an international icon, and now, near the very end of his long, brutally exhausting journey, the image the world held of him was being revealed to be flawed, human, and tragically imperfect. The psychological fallout was devastating. For a man who had spent his career playing the ultimate moral authority, the accusations were a catastrophic inversion of his identity. The voice that narrated truth was now accused of embodying hypocrisy. The face of dignity was suddenly associated with inappropriate conduct. The industry did not officially blacklist him. His immense talent and his box office gravity were still far too valuable. He continued to work, appearing in action sequels and taking on roles that required less of his moral authority and more of his action star presence. But the reverence was gone. The magical, untouchable aura that had shielded him since the 1990s had been permanently shattered. The documentary producers who once begged for his voice slowly began to look for other options. The man who had narrated the universe now seemed to prefer the quiet, heavy silence of his own shadows. He retreated from the blazing spotlight. He stopped giving lengthy interviews. He smiled rarely. When you spend your entire life building an empire out of other people's perceptions, the moment they stop perceiving you as a god, you're forced to finally look in the mirror and confront the flawed, fragile mortal staring back at you. Morgan Freeman was no longer the voice of God. He was just a tired, grieving, physically broken 81-year-old man, standing in the ashes of his own mythology. But as the storm of public opinion eventually moved on to its next target, Morgan did not surrender to bitterness. He realized that if the world of humanity was too noisy, too judgmental, and too chaotic to navigate, he simply needed to find a completely different world to inhabit. He packed his bags, walked away from the flashing cameras of Hollywood, and returned to the very soil that had once tried to erase his existence. The invisible boy was going back to Mississippi. But this time, he was not going back to pick cotton. He was going back to find the absolute, ultimate peace that can only be discovered when you finally stop caring about what the rest of the world thinks of you. The Beekeeper, the mortal god, and the final piece. If a man lives long enough, the circle of his life inevitably, beautifully closes. Today, in the year 2026, at 88 years old, Morgan Freeman has retreated from the glittering, anxious epicenter of Hollywood, returning to his 124-acre ranch in Charleston, Mississippi. Think about the staggering poetry of that geography. He left that town as a penniless, invisible boy in the segregated South. He returned to it as a cinematic titan and a deeply scarred survivor. The toll of nearly 9 decades is undeniable. His movements are measured and slow. The chronic fire of fibromyalgia and the iconic black compression glove on his paralyzed hand serve as daily physical reminders that he is no longer the invincible cinematic god. He is a fragile, aging, and incredibly mortal man. But far away from the flashbulbs and the cynical judgment of the internet, Morgan discovered a sanctuary no studio could ever manufacture. He converted his estate into a beast sanctuary. Why would the man with the greatest voice in storytelling dedicate his twilight years to insects that make absolutely no sound? Because the bees do not require performance. "I just feed them," Morgan once noted with a soft, genuine smile. The bees do not care about his Oscar nominations. They do not care about the heartbreaking loss of his granddaughter. And they absolutely do not care about the scandalous headlines that stain his legacy. They only demand absolute, unadulterated presence. For a man who spent his entire existence being judged by millions, the mindless, gentle humming of the hives is the ultimate symphony of forgiveness. His story was never really about perfection. The world desperately wanted him to be the flawless, omnipotent God he played on screen. But gods do not bleed. Gods do not suffer chronic nerve pain, and they do not weep in the dark over the shattered bodies of the children they loved. Morgan Freeman is something infinitely more impressive. He is a human being who simply refused to disappear. He survived systemic racism, 30 years of crushing rejection, a paralyzing crash, unspeakable grief, and the violent collapse of his own pedestal. His voice will echo in the digital archives forever. Generations from now, people will still hear that weary, hopeful baritone telling them to get busy living or get busy dying. But the man himself, tired, brilliant, and magnificently resilient, is finally at peace. He does not need to narrate the universe anymore. He is perfectly content to sit on his southern porch, listen to the quiet hum of the earth, and simply breathe. The longest wait in Hollywood history is over. The voice of God has finally learned how to enjoy the silence. As Morgan Freeman's journey reminds us, a true legacy isn't built on flawless perfection. It is built on absolute persistence. We all carry invisible scars, but as long as we keep moving forward, we can always find our own quiet sanctuary. What about you? How do you find peace when life brings unexpected pain? What is the quiet sanctuary that keeps your spirit grounded today? Please share your stories of survival in the comments below. If this journey moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories behind the legends. Be kind to yourselves, and until next time, keep finding your peace.